October 15, 1962, 2:17 a.m. Detective Ray Sullivan's hands were shaking as he planted the bag of heroin in Willie Johnson's coat pocket. 25 grams, enough to put Bumpy's little brother away for 15 years, and Sullivan, the same cop who'd been taking bribes from the Italian families for 3 years, was about to destroy the one man who'd never paid him a dime. The setup was simple. Anonymous tip, suspicious behavior, search and arrest. Willie would be in Rikers by sunrise, and Bumpy Johnson would finally know what it felt like to lose family to the system. Sullivan called for backup. 3 patrol cars arrived. Willie was walking home from his girlfriend's apartment, completely unaware that his life was about to change forever. "Hands against the wall!" Sullivan shouted. Willie complied. The search was quick. "What do we have here?" Sullivan said, pulling out the bag like he'd just discovered it. Willie's eyes went wide. "That's not mine." But nobody was listening. The handcuffs clicked. The arrest report was filed. By 3:30 a.m., Willie Johnson was behind bars, charged with possession with intent to distribute. What Detective Sullivan didn't know, what the Italian families who'd paid him didn't know, was that Bumpy Johnson had been watching this exact scenario unfold for 30 days. And what Bumpy did in those 30 days didn't just save his brother's life. It destroyed Detective Ray Sullivan's career, his freedom, and everything he thought he knew about power in New York City. Before we dive into this story, let me ask you something. If you're watching this, you already know Bumpy Johnson doesn't play games. So hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to learn will change how you see corruption, family loyalty, and street justice forever. This story has everything: crooked cops, planted evidence, and Bumpy's most brilliant revenge plot ever. Trust me, you don't want to miss a single detail. To understand how Bumpy Johnson turned Detective Sullivan's corruption into his own destruction, you need to understand what was happening in Harlem in the fall of 1962. By 1962, Bumpy Johnson wasn't just the king of Harlem. He was the man who'd built an empire based on respect, intelligence, and an unbreakable code. While other gangsters ruled through fear and violence, Bumpy had created something different. A system where the community came first, where dirty money stayed in clean hands, and where family was everything. But Harlem was changing. The NYPD had started a new campaign called Operation Clean Sweep. On paper, it was about fighting organized crime. In reality, it was about the Italian mob families buying police protection while targeting their black competitors. And Detective Ray Sullivan was their inside man. Sullivan had been dirty for years, but he was smart about it. He only took money from the 5 families. He only planted evidence on targets they wanted removed. And he only operated in neighborhoods where nobody would believe a black man's word over a white cop's badge. It was the perfect system, until someone decided Bumpy Johnson's family was fair game. Bumpy's brother Willie was 23 years old in 1962. Unlike Bumpy, Willie had chosen a different path. He worked construction during the day and went to night school studying accounting. He'd never been arrested, never been in trouble, never even gotten a speeding ticket. Willie Johnson was everything Bumpy wanted to protect about Harlem's future. Young, clean, ambitious, and completely innocent. But that innocence made him the perfect target. The Italian families knew they couldn't touch Bumpy directly. Too many witnesses, too many connections, too much respect on the streets. But his baby brother, a construction worker walking home alone at 2 a.m., that was different. That was vulnerable. The plan came from Gino Torino, underboss of the Genovese family. "We can't break Bumpy's business," Gino had said during a meeting at Rao's restaurant, "but we can break his heart, take his brother down on a drug charge, let Bumpy spend his time and money fighting the system instead of fighting us." It was brilliant in its simplicity. Plant drugs, make the arrest. Even if Willie eventually beat the charges, the damage would be done. Legal fees would drain Bumpy's resources. Court dates would distract him from business. And the message would be clear: nobody's family was safe. Detective Sullivan was perfect for the job. Irish-American, 20-year veteran, clean record on paper. His word would stand up in court. His testimony would be believed. And his silence could be bought for $50,000. money the families considered a bargain for neutralizing Bumpy Johnson. What made this personal for Bumpy wasn't just the attack on Willie. It was the corruption of everything he'd been fighting against his entire life. Bumpy had grown up watching dirty cops plant evidence, take bribes, and destroy families for money. He'd built his empire specifically to protect Harlem from that kind of abuse. And now the same system was coming for his own blood. But Bumpy Johnson hadn't survived 30 years in the game by reacting emotionally. When the families decided to target Willie, they made one critical mistake. They assumed Bumpy operated like them, reactive, emotional, short-sighted. They thought he'd scramble to protect his brother after the fact, not before. They were wrong. Bumpy had been building intelligence networks since the 1940s. Bartenders who listened to conversations, cab drivers who remembered faces, hotel clerks who noticed meetings, and cops, clean cops who were tired of watching dirty cops destroy their profession. One of those clean cops was Detective Marcus Webb, an 8-year veteran who'd grown up in Harlem and watched Bumpy protect his neighborhood when the NYPD wouldn't. Webb had been feeding Bumpy information about police operations for 2 years, not for money, but because he believed in justice over law. On September 15, 1962, exactly 30 days before Willie's arrest, Detective Webb made a phone call that changed everything. He'd overheard Sullivan talking to Gino Torino in a bar on the Upper East Side. The conversation was specific. Willie's name, his address, his girlfriend's apartment, even his work schedule. When Webb called Bumpy that night, the conversation was short. "They're coming for Willie," Webb said. "Planted drugs, frame job, 1 month." Most men would have panicked, hidden their brother, sent him out of town, changed his routine. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't most men. Instead of preventing the setup, Bumpy decided to turn it into a trap. The meeting took place at Rao's restaurant on Pleasant Avenue, the same place where the Italian families had been making deals for decades. Gino Torino sat at his usual corner table, a plate of veal parmigiana growing cold as he explained the Willie Johnson operation to Detective Ray Sullivan. "It's simple," Gino said, cutting his veal with surgical precision. "We need Bumpy distracted. His brother goes down on a drug charge. Bumpy spends the next 6 months in courtrooms instead of counting money." Sullivan nodded, but his hands were fidgeting with his coffee cup. Even dirty cops had limits, and framing an innocent man felt different than looking the other way on mob business. What if the kid talks? What if he knows something about his brother's operation? Gino laughed, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. "Willie Johnson doesn't know anything about Bumpy's business. Kid's cleaner than a nun's conscience. That's what makes this perfect. No connections, no evidence, just your word against his." "And if Bumpy retaliates?" "With what? He can't touch a police officer without bringing the entire department down on Harlem. He can't expose you without admitting his own crimes. He's trapped, and he knows it." Sullivan took a long sip of coffee, buying time to think. $50,000 was more money than he'd see in 5 years of honest police work. His daughter needed surgery. His wife needed a better car. His mortgage was 3 months behind. The money wasn't just tempting, it was necessary. "What's the timeline?" Sullivan asked. 1 month. That gives you time to establish the surveillance, create the paper trail, build the case, make it look legitimate. October 15th is the date. Willie Johnson walks home from his girlfriend's place every Sunday night at 2 a.m., regular as clockwork. Gino reached into his jacket and pulled out a brown envelope. "Half now, half after the arrest sticks. And Sullivan, make sure it sticks. The families don't like paying for incomplete work." Sullivan took the envelope without opening it. He could feel the weight of the cash through the paper. $25,000 in hundreds, more money than he'd ever held at one time. "What about backup? I can't make this arrest alone." "Use whoever you trust. Just make sure they don't know it's a setup. As far as they're concerned, you got a legitimate tip about drug activity." What neither Gino nor Sullivan realized was that their entire conversation was being recorded. Not by the FBI, not by internal affairs, but by a private investigator named Tommy Chen, who'd been hired by Bumpy Johnson 3 weeks earlier. Chen was a former military intelligence officer who'd learned surveillance in Korea and perfected it in New York's corporate world. Bumpy had hired him for one specific job: document every meeting between Detective Sullivan and any member of the 5 families. Chen had been following Sullivan for weeks, photographing meetings, recording conversations, building a file that would have made J. Edgar Hoover jealous. The Rouse meeting was just the latest piece of evidence in what Bumpy was planning to be the most comprehensive corruption case in NYPD history. But documentation wasn't enough. Bumpy needed more than evidence. He needed leverage. And that meant letting Sullivan's plan proceed exactly as planned, while secretly recording every illegal step along the way. After the Rouse meeting, Sullivan began laying the groundwork for Willie's arrest. He filed false surveillance reports claiming he'd observed suspicious activity around Willie's girlfriend's apartment building. He created fictional confidential informants who supposedly reported drug sales in the area. He even planted evidence at the arrest scene 3 days early, hiding the heroin bag behind a dumpster where he could find it at the right moment. Every single one of these preparations was photographed and documented by Chen's surveillance team. By October 10th, Bumpy Johnson had enough evidence to destroy Sullivan's career and send him to prison for conspiracy, evidence tampering, and corruption. But destroying Sullivan wasn't the endgame. The endgame was making Detective Ray Sullivan into an unwitting double agent who would bring down the entire network of corrupt cops working for the Italian families. And that required letting Willie get arrested, letting Sullivan think his plan was working, and then turning the detective's own corruption into the weapon that would destroy his handlers. What Detective Sullivan didn't know, what Gino Torino didn't know, was that Bumpy Johnson had been orchestrating this entire operation from day one. While Sullivan was building his false case against Willie, Bumpy was building a true case against Sullivan. But Bumpy's plan went deeper than just catching a dirty cop. He understood something that his enemies didn't. Corruption was like cancer. You couldn't just cut out one tumor and call it cured. You had to trace it back to its source and eliminate the entire system. That's why Bumpy didn't warn Willie about the setup. That's why he didn't interfere with Sullivan's preparations. And that's why he let his innocent brother get arrested, handcuffed, and thrown into a cell at Rikers Island. The decision nearly destroyed Bumpy emotionally. Willie called him from jail, confused and terrified. "Bumpy, they said I had drugs. I've never touched drugs in my life. You know that. Mom knows that. Everyone knows that." Bumpy's voice was steady, but his hands were clenched into fists. "I know, Willie. I'm going to fix this, but I need you to trust me and keep your mouth shut. Don't talk to anyone. Don't make any deals. Don't even talk to a public defender. I'm sending my lawyer first thing in the morning. How long will I be here?" "Not long," Bumpy said, though he knew it would be the longest 30 days of both their lives. While Willie sat in Rikers, Bumpy put the next phase of his plan into motion. He had Detective Marcus Webb arrange a meeting with FBI agent Robert Kennedy, not the Attorney General's brother, but a career federal investigator who'd been trying to build corruption cases against the NYPD for years. The meeting took place in a diner in Queens at 6 a.m. on October 20th, 5 days after Willie's arrest. Bumpy slid a thick manila envelope across the table to Agent Kennedy. Inside were photographs, recorded conversations, financial records, and a complete timeline of Detective Sullivan's activities. "What am I looking at?" Kennedy asked, flipping through the documents. "The biggest police corruption scandal in New York history," Bumpy replied. "Detective Ray Sullivan taking bribes from the Genovese family, planting evidence, framing innocent citizens. And that's just one cop. I've got evidence on 12 more." Kennedy studied the photographs of Sullivan meeting with Gino Torino. "How did you get these?" "Does it matter? The evidence is solid. Dates, times, witnesses, recordings. Everything you need to take down a network that's been operating for years." "And what do you want in return?" Bumpy leaned back in his booth. "My brother's charges dropped. Full exoneration, public apology, and Detective Sullivan's confession to everything he's done over the past 3 years. Kennedy laughed. "You want Sullivan to confess? Why would he do that?" "Because I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse. And because by the time I'm done with him, confession will be his only way out of spending the rest of his life in federal prison. The FBI agent closed the folder. You realize this makes you a federal informant? You realize the risks? The only risk is to corrupt cops and mob families. And I've been fighting both of those my entire life. 3 days later, Agent Kennedy presented the evidence to his supervisor, who immediately authorized a federal investigation into NYPD corruption. But instead of arresting Sullivan immediately, they decided to use Bumpy's evidence to build a larger case. Sullivan would remain free, unaware that he was now under federal surveillance. Meanwhile, Bumpy was preparing the psychological pressure that would break Detective Sullivan's will to fight. He had Tommy Chen's team begin following Sullivan everywhere, not hiding, but making themselves visible. Sullivan would see the same car behind him on his way to work, the same man reading a newspaper outside his favorite restaurant, the same photographer taking pictures of his house. The message was clear: you're being watched, documented, and recorded. Every move you make is evidence. Every decision you make is permanent. By October 30th, Detective Sullivan was a nervous wreck. He'd stopped eating regularly. He'd started drinking heavily. He'd even called in sick to work 3 times in 2 weeks. The psychological pressure was working, but the final piece of Bumpy's plan required perfect timing. Because on November 1st, exactly 30 days after Willie's arrest, Detective Ray Sullivan was going to receive a phone call that would offer him one last chance to save himself. And like every desperate man before him, he was going to take it. November 1st, 1962, 8 p.m. Detective Ray Sullivan's phone rang while he was sitting in his kitchen, staring at a half-empty bottle of whiskey and wondering how his life had gone so wrong. For 30 days, he'd been seeing shadows everywhere. Cars following him, men taking photographs, anonymous phone calls with no voice on the other end. Detective Sullivan? The voice was calm, professional, familiar somehow. Who is this? Someone who knows about the envelope Gino Torino gave you at Rao's restaurant. Someone who knows about the heroin you planted in Willie Johnson's coat. Someone who knows everything. Sullivan's blood went cold. I don't know what you're talking about. October 15th, 2:17 a.m. You planted 25 grams of heroin in an innocent man's pocket. You filed false reports. You lied under oath. You took $50,000 to frame a construction worker who'd never committed a crime in his life. The detective's hand was shaking so badly he could barely hold the phone. What do you want? I want to meet. Tomorrow night. Pier 47, 11 p.m. Come alone. And detective, don't even think about not showing up. Because if you're not there, every piece of evidence I have goes straight to the FBI. And trust me, what I have will put you in federal prison for the rest of your life. The line went dead. Sullivan spent the next 24 hours in hell. He considered running. He considered suicide. He even considered calling Gino Torino for help. But in the end, fear won. Fear of prison, fear of exposure, fear of losing everything he'd spent 20 years building. November the 2nd, 11 p.m. Pier 47. The fog was rolling in from the Hudson River, creating shadows that moved like ghosts in the yellow streetlight. Sullivan arrived 10 minutes early, his service weapon loaded and ready. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew his life was about to change forever. At exactly 11 a.m., a figure emerged from the fog. Tall, well-dressed, moving with the confidence of a man who owned whatever ground he walked on. Even before Sullivan could see his face clearly, he knew who it was: Bumpy Johnson. Detective Sullivan, Bumpy said, stopping about 10 feet away. Thank you for coming. Sullivan's hand moved toward his gun. You're under arrest for... For what? Bumpy interrupted, his voice calm as death. For having evidence of your crimes? For knowing about your corruption? For protecting my innocent brother from your lies? I don't know what you think you know, but... Bumpy reached into his coat and pulled out a thick manila folder. I know you took $50,000 from Gino Torino to frame Willie Johnson. I know you've been planting evidence for 3 years. I know you've taken bribes from the 5 families totaling over $200,000. He opened the folder and began reading like he was reciting a grocery list. September 15th, you met with Anthony Castellano at the Stork Club. Discussed planting cocaine on Marcus Washington. October 3rd, you received $15,000 for falsifying evidence in the Roberto Sanchez case. October 8th, you planted heroin behind the dumpster at 125th Street, preparing to frame my brother. Sullivan's face went white. Every date was correct. Every detail was accurate. Every crime was documented with the precision of a federal investigation. How could you possibly know all this? Bumpy smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Detective, I've been watching you longer than you've been watching Willie. The question isn't how I know. The question is what you're going to do about it. Sullivan's voice cracked. What do you want? I want you to confess to everything, every bribe, every frame job, every crime you've committed in the past 3 years. I want you to walk into the FBI field office tomorrow morning and tell them the truth about the corruption in the NYPD. They'll put me in prison. Yes, they will, but they'll also put you in protective custody. Because if you don't confess, if you try to fight this, I'm not just going to the FBI. I'm going to every family you've wronged, every man you've framed, every criminal you've protected. And I'm going to tell them exactly how you betrayed their trust. Sullivan's breathing was shallow, panicked. The families will kill me if I talk. The families will kill you anyway. You're a liability now. Too much heat, too much exposure. Your only chance is federal protection in exchange for testimony. Bumpy stepped closer. But here's what makes this simple, Detective. You're going to confess because it's the right thing to do. Because Willie Johnson is innocent, and you know it. Because 23 other men are sitting in prison right now because of evidence you planted and crimes you invented. Sullivan's shoulders slumped in defeat. And if I confess, what happens to your brother? Willie walks free tomorrow morning. Full exoneration, clean record, and he never knows that his big brother had to make a deal with a corrupt cop to save his life. The detective stared out at the dark water of the Hudson River. 20 years of service, pension gone, family destroyed, life over. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was war with Bumpy Johnson, and that was a war nobody won. I'll need immunity, Sullivan whispered. You'll get what you deserve, Bumpy replied. Nothing more, nothing less. November 3rd, 1962, 9 a.m. Detective Ray Sullivan walked into the FBI field office on Federal Plaza carrying a briefcase full of evidence and a confession that would destroy the careers of 13 police officers and send 4 members of the 5 families to prison. By noon, Willie Johnson was walking out of Rikers Island a free man. All charges dropped. Record expunged. The New York District Attorney issued a public apology, admitting that Detective Sullivan had planted the evidence and falsified the arrest report. Word spread through the NYPD like wildfire. 12 other corrupt cops were arrested within the week. Internal Affairs launched the largest corruption investigation in department history. And Gino Torino, realizing that Sullivan had enough evidence to destroy the entire operation, disappeared to Sicily and never returned. Detective Sullivan pled guilty to conspiracy, evidence tampering, bribery, and civil rights violations. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison with the possibility of parole after 7 years in exchange for his cooperation. He served his time quietly in protective custody and was released in 1969. He moved to Florida and worked as a security guard until his death in 1987. The corruption network that had operated for years was completely dismantled. Clean cops were promoted, dirty cops were removed, and the Italian families learned a lesson they would never forget. Touching Bumpy Johnson's family was a mistake that could destroy their entire operation. Willie Johnson never knew the full details of how his freedom was secured. As far as he knew, the system worked. Justice prevailed. The truth came out. Bumpy let him believe that, because sometimes the best protection is innocence. But in Harlem, everyone knew the truth. Bumpy Johnson had turned his enemies' corruption into their destruction. He'd played chess while they played checkers, and he'd proven once again that in his neighborhood, family wasn't just blood, It was sacred. This story proves something that most people miss about real power. It's not about violence. It's not about fear. It's about patience, intelligence, and turning your enemy's strength against them. Bumpy Johnson could have solved the Sullivan problem with a bullet. Instead, he solved it with evidence, strategy, and an understanding of human nature that his enemies never saw coming. He protected his family not by hiding from the system, but by using the system's own rules to destroy the people who corrupted it. In Harlem, respect isn't given, it's earned. And that night on Pier 47, Detective Ray Sullivan learned that lesson the hard way. Look, if this story gave you chills, hit that subscribe button and that notification bell. Drop a like if you understand why Bumpy's strategy was absolutely brilliant. And let me know in the comments, do you think Bumpy should have let Willie in on the plan, or was protecting his innocence the right move? Next week, we're diving into the story of how Bumpy Johnson walked into a police precinct to turn himself in, and walked out with the captain's badge. You don't want to miss that one. Remember, in the game of power, it's not about the cards you're dealt. It's about how you play them.